We are now live on YouTube with the February 13th meeting of the Node.js modules team. We have a huge agenda, so let's just kick off. Jordan Harband has some thoughts to share before we get started.
Yeah, so basically I think it's really easy for us when specifics like pull requests or implementations are proposed to kind of rat hole and get stuck on the details and the specifics. So I think my suggestion is that it might be useful if we open each of these agenda topics with kind of a quick summary of the intentions for it, like what are you trying to achieve and like what are the goals, so that even if we don't all necessarily agree on them, we can be on the same page before kind of diving in on the details.
That makes sense. And with that being said, let's kick right in. I have a doc that we'll be following, and I hope that I have managed to accomplish that. So the first topic, which will take 5 minutes on the clock at least, maybe we won't need it, is to reach consensus on a timeline. The timeline that's been proposed has been to replace the flagged implementation in Node.js core before Node.js 12 ships in April of 2019, and to unflag that implementation before Node 12 moves to LTS in October. Yeah, I guess I could share my screen. Give me 1 second because I need to close a bunch of noisy things first. Does anyone have any objections to this timeline?
Just to confirm, that's to replace the flagged implementation by April and then possibly unflagged by October?
Yes.
Okay.
Jordan, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I think those are two very different discussions. I think that replacing the flagged implementation is kind of less of a big deal because it's flagged and we can break it at any time. I think committing to a timeline to unflag is, I think, a very different discussion.
Could we maybe frame it as a goal for a timeline, but that like anything else in this group, we can iterate based on what's like the practical reality of our situation? I would like that to be the scope of the discussion we're having, is trying to accomplish those timelines. And we'll be pragmatic about those timelines as we get to there. Does that change your...
Yeah, I mean, somewhat, but like my concern that I've voiced in previous meetings is that as often happens with product work too, when you're trying to meet a deadline, you focus more on what you can get out the door and less about the right implementation. And in the case of modules, I continue to be concerned that this isn't something we can get out and iterate on, because once it gets out there, people are going to depend on things that we'll want to change. And so it's not as flexible as an API. So yeah, we can discuss it with those terms as a goal. It would be nice to get to the level that we can unflag it, in October. I just want to make sure we're not overly prioritizing the timeline.
Yep. Okay, that is noted. So just quickly, so we can maybe win some time back. One more time, does anyone explicitly object to the scope of this conversation being trying to accomplish this timeline? Great, so we have consensus on that. We can move on to the next issue that we have, which is what features are out of scope. And we could potentially win back a whole bunch of time right now if people agree to this. I am proposing that what is out of scope for this timeline is VM modules and package.exports. What this specifically means, in my personal opinion, is that it will not be on our roadmap, it will not be on our timeline. We will update the phases doc to reflect this, and that both of these problems independently can continue to be worked on in core, can be flagged individually for their own needs, but it won't be the focus of this group. Does anyone object to the identifying of VM modules and package exports as proposals?
Just to clarify, when you say package.exports, are you referring to the package exports, package.json exports thing that Jan proposed?
Yeah.
Okay.
I have a clarifying question.
Yep.
Given, I guess, VM modules ongoing, slow development in core, it's expected it will not be removed in order to merge our implementation into core, right?
Can you repeat that one more time?
Us merging our finalized implementation into core,
yeah,
should not remove VM modules.
Yes, it would be out of scope for our implementation. Now, if there's any work that needs to be done in VM modules because of the changed implementation, that would become a responsibility of core that we may have to help with. But I think the idea is like replacing the implementation is out of scope for this stage. And I like the idea that was phrased before where it's like, we'll keep VM modules behind its own flag, and that can be worked on as its own independent project.
I have a question there. Does this mean that VM modules could become unflagged before ECMA modules is unflagged if it's its own thing? How independent is it?
Well, Jeff, I'll call you in just 1 second, but I think I think we need to take things with a grain of salt when we talk about things like this. The modules group as it exists right now is not a chartered working group. So in like practical, like rule lawyering fashion, the project could do whatever they want and choose to ignore our suggestions or what we try to bring forward. I think a big part of this, when we land this update, will be trying to become chartered, and within our charter, actually defining what part of the node code base we own, in which case we could define something like that. But I think a lot of this will be based on good faith, and I think that there's enough people in this chat right now that are part of Node Core that if there was an attempt to unflag VM modules and the modules team as it exists right now was not comfortable with that, individuals such as myself would object to that happening on behalf of the team. And we could work towards being chartered with that being in our charter. But I think it was mostly from the last meeting, it sounded like it was more work than we had bandwidth to do based on the timelines that we want to accomplish right now.
Okay, thank you.
Jeffrey, you have your hand up. Jeffrey's hands down. Brad, you had made a comment about wanting to preface the.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. Sorry, I had been talking with Gus about this in the thread. My impression of VM modules is that it's dependent on the regular ES modules work that we're doing, which is fine. But that means though that like when we're ready to ship, say for the April deadline of the new thing flagged, it just means that VM modules needs to be updated awfully fast to be current with ES modules and not like broken. Mm-hmm. And I think VM modules shouldn't hold up us shipping the new ES modules. So either it can be updated in time and then they both, get updated together, or then we should remove VM modules temporarily until it can get updated and everyone's okay with the update, and then it gets added back in. But I don't think we should leave in a version of VM modules that corresponds to the older implementation of ES modules, and then it's like just broken.
That makes sense. Gus, you've got your hand up. We've got 23 seconds as a heads up.
Okay, just as the virtue of me being the person who works on VM modules, also being in this group, I can keep that tracked pretty well. Personally, I'll make whatever changes have to be done myself. I don't think we should worry about that.
Excellent. Thank you, Gus. Okay, so we're done. Do we have consensus? Does anyone object to identifying these as out of scope and updating our phase document accordingly? Okay, great. On to the contentious topics. Common Js Interop, there's been a lot of discussion in number 264. Brad, you had that comment that you made that I guess we just skipped over about context. Was there something that you wanted to add there?
I put notes on the agenda just basically when we're discussing these topics, there's kind of a few things we can discuss rather than just stating one feature is more attractive than another feature as we're trying to go forward. We should just keep in mind what we can do for acceptable iteration if we can stage things so that we can have some minimal approach that's easier to reach consensus on. And in particular, what would be considered breaking, which probably means we can't iterate on it, versus what could be considered additive. So basically SymVer major versus SymVer minor. Also, we should probably look at what already exists in the tooling today if we're going to be, upsetting the tooling in such a way that we introduce a new way of writing code that cannot be done with current tooling, versus if we can ship some subset of current tooling's behavior. And finally, what can we do that allows people to iteratively migrate? If we can't allow them to iteratively migrate without some refactoring, what subset of behaviors could we allow as a safe path forward so people can assume that their code is safe to refactor even if they get additive features later? So that's it.
Mm-hmm. So a couple thoughts that I have right now, and we can dive into this. I think that, I have some notes here, and I did my best to try to scope this. So we have common Js Interop, which is the thing that we're talking about right now. We have 20 minutes for it. I would like to propose that we spend 5 minutes just defining the space and making sure that we're all in agreement that the things that we're talking about are the things we should be talking about. I would like then for us to take 10 minutes to just talk through, because there's been a lot of debate on this topic, especially about the out of order execution related stuff. And then after 10 minutes, take 5 minutes to review those takeaways, reach consensus, and vote on things that require votes. Does that seem like a reasonable way of breaking it down for people?
Yeah,
Okay.
it seems fun.
One other thing that I wanted to bring up really quickly was that I think that there is a severe risk right now with the way that we're doing this of having some sort of design by committee vote implementation that comes out at the end of this that's not something anyone wants and is maybe not even a realistic thing. So when we kind of get through these votes, or maybe even before, I think that there's kind of two ways we can approach this. One whereby whatever we vote and whatever the outcome is something that we just move forward with. I would like to suggest an augment to that, whereby at the end, when we voted on everything and we have the picture of what the thing is, that we should then try to reach consensus on whether or not we want to move forward with that. If we don't have consensus to move forward, then we vote on the implementation. And if it's then in turn a vote for that implementation, we move forward. But I just want to add essentially a thing at the end so that we review this. And perhaps if we do that and we aren't able to reach consensus on the implementation, we maybe do an out-of-band meeting next week and try to do this exercise again and see if we land somewhere different. Does that seem reasonable to people?
I might say we skip the consensus step if we're going to be doing a vote. Okay,
we can do that too.
Why don't we just see where all the votes land first, and then we can talk about next steps after that, if that's okay.
Okay, great. So let's define the space. I've got 5 minutes for this. I believe for Js Interop, I did my best to try to identify, I think the two things that we need to reach consensus on are named exports and default behavior. Specifically for named exports, the things that we need to reach consensus on are, one, should we continue to pursue dynamic modules at TC39? This would be one path for us to try to get named exports. The other one is, should we rely on out-of-order execution as a way of getting named exports? For default behavior, I think the first question is can we even ship named exports? Is this something it looks like we're going to be able to do, and that will rely on the earlier named exports outcome? The other is, if we only ship default, is that okay? So that we only export default and not have named exports? Or alternatively, are we okay with shipping without interop? And kind of as a caveat to that is does it make it better if we make it explicit that the design space is open? And what I mean by that is, I think it's okay for us to maybe ship something that doesn't include interop today, but that if we want to continue to pursue dynamic modules, for example, and allow it later in the future if we can come up with a real solution, I think it's more permissive than just being no, we don't have it, we'll never have it. Is there anything that people would like to add to this or comment on? Is there anything that seems biased or we should change before we start kind of discussing the problem space?
Just to clarify, you use the word interop for importing common JS modules.
Yes.
Okay.
Does that clarify?
Yep.
Okay. I'm not seeing So I guess, yeah, Jeff adds a bit about like whether or not we even want to have import of common JS packages to be allowed at all. I think that as far as I know, and based on our prior consensus and our prior documents, I think that the intent was very much that if we can do it with named exports, that we had consensus to ship transparent interop. That was one of the things we had in the initial mission statement. Does anyone disagree with that? Okay, so let's get into the nitty gritty. Named exports. Should we kind of dive into the bits around out-of-order execution first, or the dynamic modules bit, maybe?
So I prefer we just do them in order so we don't get jumping around.
Okay. So let's discuss the topic. Should we continue to pursue dynamic modules at TC39? Does anyone have anything to add? I see, Brad, you have your hand up.
Yes, I would like us to consider if we can treat this as an additive change for what we land before April. The behavior of dynamic modules can kind of be treated as a extension of what we can do with a default export. I feel like we can still pursue it even if we land without using that to provide named exports, because I do not see this as a breaking change. It wouldn't be something I consider Simver major if we landed it. That's it.
Excellent, thank you. Jordan?
So 2 comments. The response to Bradley would be, before it's flagged, I think we can have anything be additive, or before it's unflagged. After being unflagged, I'm much more skeptical that we can get away with doing that. And then as the question is, should we continue to pursue it? There is established consensus at TC39 that we will change the module spec as possible, which includes getting permission from browsers and so on, to make things easier for Node. So despite that there are feelings about the implementation within TC39 and within this group, I think it's still worth pursuing, and there's still change that can be had there. One of the changes that seemed to, get some traction was actually removing, I believe, source text module records from the spec and letting that just be a type of abstract module record. And my understanding is that that's the only thing that we'd need to change to enable dynamic modules. And as long as the browsers agreed with that, like as browsers and Node had a shared concept of what these modules would mean, then we would be able to have the same behavior. So like that's a possible path forward. So I think we should continue to pursue it.
Okay, cool. Jeremiah, is your response to what Jordan just said, or would you be open to me just adding a quick caveat?
Go ahead.
So one of the things that's worth looking at, Lynn Clark has a proposal open right now that I think is almost ready to land, adding a new kind of module record, which is a cyclical module record, which would be in between the abstract module record and the source text module record. It abstracts out part of what is currently embedded in the source text module record. And WebAssembly module records will inherit from the cyclical module record instead of source text or abstract. The only reason I mention that is that may be important pre-work to removing the source text module record, because it has found one of those common patterns. Rob Palmer asks if there's any indication that the Chrome team would accept that change. I believe, and please someone correct me if I'm wrong, that Dominic Denicola was one of the people who had suggested removing the source module record altogether.
Yeah, he's the original, or the origin of that suggestion, yeah. And
so, and then Jeremiah, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, so I wanted to mention that I think I agree that dynamic modules should be able to be Semver minor from just shipping default. And also, I think we should continue to pursue it if as seems to be the case, that TC39 would still, as a whole, be willing to make adjustments to allow us to do this in one way or other.
Okay, thank you, Jeremiah. So it seems to me, and then maybe I know we said we were going to do the consensus afterwards, but it feels like we already have it. It seems like we have consensus of moving forward with trying to continue to pursue dynamic modules. Is that accurate? Jeffrey, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like there's no reason not to continue pursuing it, but in terms of trying to ship something by April, don't we kind of have to make decisions long before we potentially get some kind of response from them?
The next meeting's in March, so we can work on trying to get something together by the March meeting. Let's punt on digging into that too much until we start talking about like what we need to ship, because one of the things that we had discussed was actually drafting up 2 different plans, and one plan being like, what do we do if we're able to get dynamic modules in by March? Another being what we would do if we can't. Guy Bedford, do you have your hand up?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that. Just if this is pursued and there's kind of some progress made there, just to make sure that that doesn't affect the timeline too much, because say, for example, spec work was happening on that and it was coming up to the October time to flag, then it could be possible to end up in a situation in which it isn't possible to unflag because this work is still ongoing. And that maybe some kind of consensus needs to be made on that as well, because that could be a risk of then having that spec process hold things up too. Or is everyone okay with this process taking another year?
I would say personally, I'll just double check to make sure no one has their hand up right now. No. Guy, to me, it kind of feels like this is a separate question altogether. And maybe this is a good caveat in the should we rely on out-of-order execution. And the reason I say that is because it kind of feels like to me, if we decide as a group to move forward with out-of-order execution, then there isn't a need to move forward with dynamic modules because we've already done something that's different that will have prior art and behavior. Whereas if we decide not to move forward with out-of-order execution, then we can still pursue dynamic modules. And then I guess the choice would be, do we want to ship export default in the meantime or not? But I think that these two things are interconnected. Jeffrey?
So what I'm saying is, if we want to ship export default or not, should be a clear consensus to know, because otherwise there is a real risk of delays in dynamic modules causing delays in unflagging. And I'm just saying that's a scenario that we want to avoid.
Yep. Brad?
I would just second that. Whatever we do with default exports should be considered separate from this dynamic modules. So,
and it's what we have in the next section for default behavior. So I think we should go into out-of-order execution because we only have 10 minutes.
Sorry, I didn't get to speak. I was just going to say that there's no reason we can't do both. Like, we could even merge in out-of-order execution and still pursue this at TC39. If TC39 says yes, we can just replace one with the other. It's not, we don't have to make like hard decisions now that we are stuck with.
I'm not sure I agree with that, but let's dig into that when we dig into out-of-order execution. Wes says, I'd be fine with out-of-order execution and replacing with dynamic modules to correct the execution order when ready. Surprisingly, little code relies on execution order, and when it does matter, there will always be workarounds to make it so it does not. And I would maybe agree with that when it comes to pre-flagging, but not post-flag. Brad?
So I do want to bring up, there have been CVEs and exploits due to reentrancy and unexpected times. A big one was the OSX sandbox got escaped by a proxy trap last year. Even if we are not caring about what modules depend on order of execution, the space here is not well researched. And we have been, we did go back to TC39 trying to figure out the intent of what would happen if we did stuff out of order. So we may just want to go and revisit that. I personally am not in favor of out of order execution because it's really kind of a hairy thing to do to execute things in a different order than expected. And even if it gets you some user experience that you want, we are drastically changing something in a surprising way in my mind. And I'm very concerned about surprise, because it's something that surprises even us to think about. It's not just, oh, you reorder it and everything just works. That's it.
Okay. Gus, you have your hand up, and then I think we should just go for it, Gus. Sorry.
I just see a lot of people mentioning that evaluation order isn't like, it's indeterminate. It's not indeterminate. It's not linked to the order of the imports in your file per se, but it is very well defined and will always be the same given the same graph. And the rules of that, the depth first search algorithm in the spec, that circumvented is the thing that we're talking about when we say that it provides unexpected evaluation order.
I guess it's also worth bringing up in here, the top level await potentially is going to change execution order depending on the proposal that goes through. But that similarly does not have consensus with similar stakeholders. Brad, you have your hand up?
I just want to point out, I heavily disagree with that assessment, and top level await is not related to this issue at all.
I guess that's true, because it's execution order during the execution phase, not during the linking phase. Would that be what you would, is that why you disagree?
That's a fine phrasing.
Okay, cool. So pretend I didn't say that. So anyone else have anything to add right now on out of order execution? Their thoughts on if it's possible, or the thoughts on why maybe we shouldn't move forward with it, to give people context before we eventually have to vote on this? You have your hand up?
Yeah, sure. If I could just maybe clarify some background here. When this was brought to TC39, the context of that discussion was that here we have the ECMAScript module resolution and module algorithm, and we're integrating CommonJS modules into this graph. How should CommonJS modules be integrated? And the answer is, of course, that they should execute in the same post-order graph execution order as defined in ECMA 262 modules. And what we're doing in this out-of-order execution, well, two-phase execution PR, is not that. And so that's why I just think, to clarify, that's why it's a spec violation. If you just reconsider the model slightly, we're not actually loading CommonJS modules into the graph, because CommonJS modules are not ECMAScript abstract module records. They have no existence as a module type, and we haven't been able to turn them into a module type. So as a result, what you're getting when you import a CommonJS module is not a CommonJS module. What you're getting is the ECMAScript module that happens to export the bindings of that CommonJS module. And we actually write it out explicitly in the code. We write the export default. We write out the export let statements containing the named exports. In that model, that facade that you're actually loading, that the source text facade for the CommonJS module, is executed in exactly the right graph position. And it's executed, when it's executed, it populates those bindings. And so what we're dealing with is a gap more in like expectations as opposed to a gap in specification. And to try and narrow that gap, what we do is we carefully track all the CommonJS modules in the entire graph and make sure that the CommonJS modules always execute in the right order. And then all the ECMAScript modules execute in the right order. So you're still getting that post-order exec, which wasn't done in previous implementations. So yeah, just to clarify what's going on there. Yeah, I don't think we need to dig any deeper into that one.
Okay, quick time check for everyone. We have 3 minutes left for this entire section, including voting. So I'm going to add another 5 minutes, which means we may have to skip a different section. but just as a heads up when you're digging into things. Brad, you had something to add?
Yes, I want to go in a little bit more on what Guy Bedford was saying. Yes, executing everything ahead of time is technically not against the spec algorithms. But there are some other concerns that we mentioned in the issue thread. There are also usability concerns. So when we're talking about migrating people over, we cannot use import maps or any other mechanism to emulate the behavior we're talking about in the browser. So we would have a little bit of trouble there. Also, some things are going to be problematic to migrate to ESM because CommonJS will always execute in front of them. So things involving instrumentation, polyfills, anything that does some kind of security hardening for your context, all need to remain CommonJS for as long as this reordering occurs, like in perpetuity. They would never be good to upgrade because you would have problems with things jumping the queue and executing ahead of them.
Okay, thank you, Brad. Jan has something to add, and then I have something to add afterwards. Jan?
Yeah, right. One thing I wanted to clarify is that that is only true if there is no dynamic import prefix to the application. So what I was thinking for our instrumentation is to basically have the instrumentation loaded as modules, and then you can load the application code using dynamic import. And that way you would be able to port all your instrumentation to modules. You would just not be able to import the application code via static import.
But wouldn't that only apply to you as the application level for application level instrumentation, Jan?
Right. It would require that if you want to do hardening, you need to control the entry point.
So just kind of a clarifying question, Guy, maybe you can clarify this for me. It seems like, in theory, if the CommonJS is completely sandboxed and is its own thing with an execution order, that perhaps that's not in violation of the spirit of the spec. That's debatable. But one of the things that I'm confused about would be if there's a dynamic import anywhere inside of that CommonJS, would that not start executing and instantiating the ESM tree out of phase?
That'll wait a sec.
So you can import. Instantiation is an asynchronous phase. You have to fetch from the browser. You have to fetch from the URL that you're getting the module from. So with the ECMAScript modules, any new top-level job can be started during instantiation, and as a result of that, your parts of your graph could have been executed by the time you get to execution. Execution itself is sync and well-defined, but that's sort of gets back to what Gus said at the beginning, where you don't necessarily guarantee your export order, the exact evaluation order. It also depends on what top-level jobs are present, and a dynamic import can happen at any time, and that will affect things like circular execution. It'll actually alter circular execution order. But what I'm saying is that's how modules work. That is the existing invariant. So nothing is new with dynamic module. With two-phase execution, it behaves the same way.
Jordan, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment that the original context when it was discussed with TC39 included zebra striping, where you can both import CJS and require ESM. We're clearly proceeding where you can only import CJS, but the fact that you can dynamic import in CJS has been brought up as where it still introduces some issues. So it's certainly a different discussion than the one where TC39 said this is not explicitly forbidden, but if we can write a way to forbid it, we will. The lack of require ESM kind of alters that discussion a bit, but yeah, I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, can I make a suggestion here? Because for this area, we're getting really close to time. We need to reach consensus. It seems to me like, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, we have two potential solutions that we'd like to see move forward. And a lot of the arguments for them or against them tend to be very much related to the specification and whether or not we'd be in violation of the spirit or the specification itself. We do have a meeting that's coming up in March. I believe Guy has already implemented the out-of-order execution as well as the dynamic modules. So like from a technical standpoint, we did have Jeffrey saying maybe we can have both behind a flag. I'm not sure how possible that is and how much infrastructure we'd have to put in place for that. But we very well could have two different branches and two different builds. May it make sense that at least for these two approaches, that we think about it more so as two potential solutions to name exports that we defer to a discussion with TC39 to see if our assumptions about what is in and out of scope for the committee is accurate. And then to iterate on that decision in March, since we'll already have the implementation done, which can allow us to move to the default behavior discussion, which is actually way more about like the high level rather than the implementation. Jordan, you have your hand up?
That was from before.
Okay, Brad, you have your hand up?
I would just comment that I do not consider out-of-order execution something we could consider as an additive change. So keep that in mind.
Yeah, and to be very explicit about what I'm suggesting is that we bring both of these proposals and ask the committee if we think we have concerns based on attendance and based on notes, but we should get like a very explicit statement from the committee. And the committee could very well say, this is out of scope, we don't care, it's up to you. And in my opinion, that would very much change the dialogue we're having.
I would not like to bring out-of-order execution to the committee again. Someone else can.
I'm happy to. We're just about out of time. Jeff and JDD, are you able to very quickly summarize your thoughts here?
Yeah, I want to see some votes. Like, let's just vote on it. Like, if they're both allowed, which one would you prefer? If you can only get dynamic modules, would you be okay with it over not, or whatever the alternative is, like default only or no interop at all? If you can't get dynamic, would you be okay with out of order over default only or no interop at all? Like, okay. We've got 18 people on here. Let's just see where people stand.
Yeah, I hear you, but it sounds like we may be able to reach consensus on an approach that doesn't involve voting.
So we can still pursue, talking to various committees in addition to just getting a sense of where all 16 of us feel.
I agree with Jeffrey. I think it's important to know, for example, if we're okay with just the default, then we can move forward with that. If people are okay with the two-phase execution, then we can, that we can move forward with that. And it just helps to know where we stand, I think.
Okay. JD, did you have anything to add there?
Yeah, just real quick. Let me lower my hand. If we're talking about dynamic modules, are we talking about a progression of dynamic modules? So not the exact same thing that was presented in January, but maybe a progression of that allows for either removing the source text module record from ECMA 262 or adding deferred namespace objects. As long as it's not the exact same thing that was presented in January, I'm okay with continued pursuing and iterating on that. But if it's just like rubber stamping the same thing that was presented, I'm not for that. That's it.
I think it would be an update, and I have a doc that I've been keeping to track all of the objections and try to move that forward.
Okay.
Okay, so let's just move towards a consensus/vote and run through these things. Does anyone object to us continuing to pursue dynamic modules at TC39? Okay, so we have consensus to continue working on this. We don't need to vote. Should we rely?
No, we need to vote. If we don't get any further information from TC39, are we going to merge it in?
Can you let me run through this? Because I'll work up to that, I promise.
Okay.
Does anyone object to relying on out-of-order execution as a means of solving named exports?
I do.
Yeah, I do too.
Okay, so as a vote, can everyone who is in support, or actually everyone who objects, if you object to out of order execution as an approach, can you just put a -1 into the chat right now? If you are in support of out of order execution, can you please put a +1 into the chat right now?
Sorry, I'm trying to find the chat.
And I'm pinging Rob right now. So I am seeing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 +1s and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 -1s. So we have 11 votes here. We have 16 people on the call. Has some people not chimed in on this? I believe everyone who's chimed in is a voting member. I just pinged Rob Palmer to see if he has anything. We've got a -1 for Rob, so we've got a tie. Great.
Defer.
So, pardon? Oh,
We should probably defer that until.
oh no, Kevin Smith says -1, not supporting. So we actually have, I guess, 7 against and 5 for out of order execution.
Sorry, I was fumbling for the chat and then got confused about the instructions.
So just doing the count one more time. Myself, Gus, Brad, Jeremiah, Jordan, Rob, and Kevin are against. Daniel, JDD, Wes, Jan, and Jeff are for. It's 7-5. And with 12 votes, that is the majority. Now, a quick question for everyone on these votes. In the past, with the TSC, we have tried to make it so that those who are not in the meeting have an opportunity to vote. Do we want to at least post the results of these votes and give other members of the group a week or something to chime in? Or do we just move forward with the results that we just had? I guess we have 7. We have got, how many members in the group do we have? We have 18 members in the group.
It was my impression that this was to give an understanding to the group of where we sat on things and not necessarily a binding decision.
Yeah, that was my understanding as well. I also wanted to make clear, like, would anyone change their vote or feel the same way if dynamic isn't a possibility for some reason? Like if this was the only way to get named exports, you would still say, no, I'd rather not have named exports at all.
I would rather just go ahead and do dynamic modules regardless of the spec, to be honest, but
Well,
I'm
we
sure
can't do
people don't
dynamic
agree
modules
with me on that.
without Nate support.
Okay, I think that we need to move forward on this one for right now. I am just going to, and we got a -1 from Hassan as well. So we have 8 against and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 for, which is 13. There's 6 members unaccounted for, and we can come back on that afterwards. Ahmed, just as a heads up, because you're an observer, unfortunately, the vote does not register as part of this vote. Apologies for that. I'll open an issue. Oh, sorry, Daniel, I just lowered your hand. You were going to say something?
Quick question. In the notes, do we want to anonymize the votes or just leave the count?
I think we should keep the names.
Leave names?
Yes. Does anyone disagree with that?
The names are on YouTube.
Yeah, this meeting's already public. So.
Okay. So the next one for default behavior, I think we can skip this bit of like, can we ship named exports? I think it's like, basically depends on above solutions. Does anyone disagree with that?
It seems like we definitely could if we really wanted to.
And maybe this is to your point, Jeremiah, and Jan, I'll get to your hand in just one second. I guess the next thing is, does anyone object? Does anyone think that we require it to be spec compliant. Because, Jeremiah, you just made the statement that you were okay with shipping dynamic modules if it was not spec compliant. Jan, you're good?
Yeah. That was the thing that I wanted to say something about.
Okay, Brad, do you have something to add to that?
I just want to state that whatever we do, if we are not spec compliant, I don't want us to state we are.
Okay. I will go ahead and just be explicit. I would be -1 to shipping anything that isn't spec compliant. Does anyone object with that?
Can we be explicit?
I'll be explicit. We need to be spec compliant.
Right, but what I was saying is to the note that we could, in theory, do it without being spec compliant. I think that is not the whole truth, because the whole truth is that we can only do it if we are not spec compliant and have active support from V8 and also active support from the side of Chakra Core, which is a big if.
Mm-hmm. But I think that we should take both of these. Let's iterate on that afterwards. We're quickly running out of time.
Could I just ask that we get to that next vote, and then also can we please, with the remaining time, look at the other PR, since the two-phase execution PR is not being merged.
Okay. Let's get through these votes really quickly, and then Guy, can you post the links to the PRs? Does anyone object to shipping only a default? If we don't have a way to do named exports, at least in time for our launch, does anyone object to shipping just the default? Daniel, you have your raised hand?
Yeah, I have hesitations over just shipping default, because once you ship that behavior, you effectively have given the community this sort of blessing or mandate to write things in a specific way, and you basically have said this is the right way to do it. And even if there's an opening for further work, right? Even if we decide we want to actually pursue other venues in the future, it puts a weird expectation and pressure on users to write in that specific way. And so once that's set, you have less incentive to actually pursue a better user experience, in my opinion. So I would prefer we not go that venue.
Okay. As a heads up, before we dig in, we've got 6 minutes left. We are going to burn through this time. We're not even close. Should we have an out-of-band meeting next week to follow up on this? I'll start a separate email to discuss that offline. Jordan, you have something to add?
Yeah, if we decide that we can never do named, I'm very content with shipping just default. But similar to the previous topic, I'm not confident that we will be able to add named imports without causing lots of issues, whether it's actual breakage or just community churn. So I would prefer not to unflag default only if we have an intention to ever add named later.
Okay. Brad? Hands down.
I have a very uncertain availability for the next few months, starting pretty much today. So whatever happens then, just be sure remote correspondence is okay and give us some time.
Okay, excellent. Congratulations. So I think we seem, okay, so I'm going to go ahead and object. I don't think that we should ship interop with just default. Can everyone who wants us to ship interop, if we can only do default, put a +1 into the chat right now, please?
All right, interop with no or with only default?
So this would be, if we can't do named exports, are you +1 to shipping interop with just a default? Or do you want to ship no interop? Okay, so we have one, two. Okay, so we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 negatives. That's Daniel, myself, JDD, Rob Palmer, and Kevin Smith. And Wes is another one. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We have Gus in favor, Brad in favor, Guy in favor, Jordan in favor, and Jeff in favor. So that's 5-4.
Just to clarify, this was asked if we could just ship default after named is no longer on the table.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, I think that this one by itself, I don't want to rush. We have 3 minutes left. Let's dig back into this. But I think that we're leaning in the direction of not shipping default if named is still a possibility, if we haven't given up on the above approaches yet, even if they're not yet ready.
But we're going to set a timeline to that because otherwise, yeah, that's just going to...
And I think the timeline to that very, very reasonably is to go to the TC39 meeting in March with both of these and to try to get a clear response about whether or not these have legs and then iterate based on that. I'm going to probably get kicked out of this room in 2 minutes, just as a heads up. So there may be a really hard, abrupt ending. Jeremiah, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I just had a counterpoint to Daniel earlier about this. And basically, I feel like the point that he brought can be broadly applied to adding any feature or anything that is semver minor, and so is not really very applicable. We need to think about like if it can actually break or not, rather than if it's just how people are going to use it. Like if people don't use new features, then we would never add new features to anything, and we know that is false.
Mm-hmm. So this PR was requested to go to. We have 3 pull requests that are open. One for CJS named exports in a 2-phase execution and the entry points proposal. I believe right now, based on the consensus that we had, that we shouldn't move forward with this one immediately. But let's look at 32, which is the entry points proposal, implements a top-level type flag for experimental modules with the following behavior. In addition to type ESM in the package JSON is renamed to type, and a new extension .cjs is exposed. Does anyone object to this landing? Doesn't seem like we have any objections. One more time for objections. Jordan, if you're trying to talk, you're muted.
I'm not objecting to it landing, but I want to reinforce that as is, I don't think this is something we could unflag. In other words, I don't want a -- type or a type field to be unflagged unless there's also a more granular and generic like mapping mechanism. But this can merge right now because it's flagged, and that's fine. Okay.
Then, Guy, I think it's fair for you to go ahead and land this. I'll throw like a rubber stamp LGTM on it if a couple people couple people can as well beforehand. I think we do definitely need to dig back into this sooner than later. So I will open an issue to get us an out-of-band meeting for next week, which hopefully we can get enough people towards. If we can't, then we'll have to wait until 2 weeks from now. I think at the very least, we have consensus to move forward with both of these approaches to name exports at the standards, and those are kind of the things that are a little bit more time sensitive here. And then the default behavior we can dig back into. What we didn't get to is file extension resolution and loaders and the actual requirements, and we can get to those in the next meeting. Does anyone have any last things to add before I get kicked out of this office?
Are we going to do an out-of-band meeting?
I'm going to open an issue and try to make that happen. But I think that we need to have at least quorum in that meeting, especially with the things that we're having. Alternatively, what we could do is, if we can't do the out-of-band meeting, we can maybe try to just have some votes or people chime in. But let's iterate and try to do this like the way we've done it today, if possible.
Did we get consensus to take out of order to TC39? I thought we had overall negative.
Well, that wasn't what people were voting on.
Let's, you know what, let's make that the first thing that we revisit when we meet next. I think we're just going to not.
How do people feel about just sending a list of questions for the entire group to vote on between now and the out-of-band meeting? And we can debate the list in the meantime.
I'm -1 to that. I think it was really important for us to talk through this and had shared definitions. If we just start voting on things, like I really don't like the idea of voting, and we were able to get through a lot of stuff without voting. And so I'd like us to continue that. Feel free, Jeff, if you want to make an issue to discuss that approach to things, and maybe we can reach consensus on voting. Okay, thanks everyone. I'm sorry we weren't able to get through more today, but you know, I feel like we made some progress. So you know, until the next meeting, talk to you all soon.
Thank you.